All right, welcome everyone to this week's edition of the Data Resilience Spectrum Cast. Joined always by my co-host Randy Arsenault, and along with Tricia Jang and Sean Sperry, our subject matter experts around data resilience. This week we have an interesting conversation around how does the work from home imperative impact data resilience for corporations? And there might not be one single answer to this. I thought we would talk about it and let's see where it brings us. So, Tricia, you brought up this idea. What are some of your thoughts around how work from home changes what happens with data resilience?
So one of my first thoughts was if there is a breach and I, for instance, lose my workstation or whatever I'm using at home, how do I get my data back? What type of infrastructure is there as an end user to recall my data and rebuild what I need every day to do my job as a work from home employee? And the second thought was, sometimes when I'm working from home, I'll switch from one laptop to a workstation. And so how does that impact it if I'm working from multiple devices, as well as bringing up data from multiple devices?
And doesn't that raise the question of who owns the device? And then once we know we have these remote set of devices, we need to have different technologies or some set of technologies to be able to protect the data that lives on these devices, right, Sean? And then at least in my experience through the decades, let's call them legacy solutions, haven't necessarily developed their applications that have really good desktop laptop protection solutions, which means perhaps adding a third party, someone who actually does do this really well, into the mix. How does that start to change how IT thinks about this, Sean?
Well, I think it just, what I was going to say about this whole subject is I think the pandemic has just accelerated a lot of trends and mandates that were already happening to a large extent, right? And just taking something that wasn't,
exactly.
well, this is not an emergency, so we can kind of work on this a little bit at a time and push it to, well, this is an emergency, we need to figure that out now. So one of the examples that you're talking about, Steve, is, well, IBM or some companies I know of, I don't think IBM is one of them, but have had a mandate that if it's important to you, it gets stored in the cloud or on the server, period, right? If it's corporate data, that's where it stays. And I think to some extent that has kind of been put by the wayside with regard to a lot of the desktops and computing infrastructure that's been taken home now.
Yeah, I would add, endpoint security and this new level of required data protection at the edge and in the periphery of the networks under the broader category of necessities, the mother of invention. And you're absolutely right. It was progressing along at its own pace. Then suddenly COVID-19 hit and the switch was thrown, requiring entirely new levels of protection and security, new workflows, new methodologies for protecting that data and monitoring and tracking, putting enormous stress on corporate IT infrastructure and support infrastructure, endpoint device security companies. So it's been a really, on the plus side, I think, and you kind of touched on this, I would say the industry response has been pretty good. I would say by and large, there have been some, pratfalls along the way, but, by and large, I think companies and enterprises have done a pretty good job working with companies like IBM and others to enhance their protection schemes and their strategies and solutions to accommodate this new world. And I suppose another, if you can pull good news out of that, is that it is creating a new level of infrastructure protection and edge security and endpoint security that we might not otherwise have had, or it might have taken us a lot longer to get here. So I suppose that's a plus in the long term.
I think one industry that was somewhat dealing with this prior to pandemic was the universities, because if they were trying to protect their students' data, especially those theses, that research that those students were doing, we saw a lot of universities using our products and working with them to protect those computers, laptops for their students.
So at some point, university seems to be an interesting maybe side case, maybe not, right? We start to think about who owns the data. I don't really necessarily care about the device. Sean, back to your original point, right? It's about the data. So
Right.
different divisions in different organizations have different data types, and some of those organizations in the different companies may be held, maybe their data is held to a different set of standards or regulations or that sort of thing. Now all of a sudden,
Oh,
it doesn't really matter what the device is. It's a matter of where is that data going? Tricia, to your first point, right? I work on multiple systems. I care, but I don't care. But I do care if it's not supposed to be on that system. So, what are some of the things that we think folks should do to think more along the data side of things than the device side of things?
well, I was just going to say, thinking about the data, Tricia's example of academia is an interesting one, because I think academia, at least in my history, I've worked for a couple academic institutions of higher learning, and they are typically a much less controlled, much more federalized set of policies than a corporate entity like an IBM or a bank or something like that, right? I mean, trying to make the academics do something or follow some policy is like trying to herd cats. Every department is out there doing their own thing, their own way, and that's why there has always been this emphasis on taking these endpoints and trying to move them back to some centralized control or some centralized standard. Whereas in corporations, it tends to be a lot easier to make that kind of mandate, right? You will do this with your data. You will follow these rules with your data or else, type of thing.
And I agree, by having that really clear corporate or academic statement that if this is what we're protecting this share, we're protecting these applications. So if your data is out there, then it's being backed up or it's being protected, versus if you're putting it on your C drive, maybe not.
Yeah. And I think corporations also tend to run the gambit along those lines, right? I mean, if you're a financial institution or a bank, you might not only have standards, but be much more inclined to enforce those standards and make people, follow them and do things as corporate IT and corporate governments dictate. Whereas in a place like IBM, we tend to be a little less centralized and a little more put out there toward the edges, so to speak.
And I think this just goes back to where a lot of our conversations end up, is you've got to, first of all, classify your data and then make that statement about, if you want to protect it, it needs to be here, here, and here, and following these pieces, because otherwise that data is going to be scattered across all those different devices or all those different endpoints, and it would be difficult to A, say that it's secure from ransomware or something else, and B, making sure it's protected for hardware failures or lost devices or such. So taking a step back and saying, okay, if we're going to extend and expand our work from home policy, how are we making sure as a company that that information is protected and available should something happen?
Let's talk pros and cons for one quick second, right? So I think what I've heard, and I think we're right? There's two avenues. There's users are going to go and work from home. They're going to store their data and their information on their desktop and their laptop, and they're just going to go about doing their business. Then there's corporate mandate that says, look, if you really want that information protected, you should protect it on this particular device through the VPN on this drive, and we'll ensure that that drive gets protected. What are the pros and cons to each one of those? And is there a best practice?
I think you end up doing both, to be honest with you, and it depends on the sensitivity of the data. And it's a carrot and a stick approach, right? I mean, you want to try and incentivize the people who are using your service to take advantage of it, because it's better, it's more secure, it helps the business, right? At least for a lot of types of data. And hopefully people will see those advantages and actually do that. There may be some types of data where you rule with an iron fist, right? Like, it's not acceptable to have this type of data,
Mhm.
not in this secure location.
Sorry. And
Go ahead.
that's a really good point. And I think you're right. It is a combination of both. And I vehemently agree that you gotta incent people to adopt the policy willingly, so you don't have to kind of force it on them, because they're always going to be more productive and, happier as a result. And there are ways that these services can be made more attractive or more, user friendly, if you will. So I use Box, right? Because I use it through IBM. I use Box folders, and we use Box as a provider. I've also used Box personally for years and years and years, because I really like the global sync and share. So I use multiple systems. I use my work laptop. I use my editing station. I use all these different machines, and Box does an exceptionally good job of global sync and share. So if I edit something in one location, within 30 seconds, it's available on all the locations. So if I happen to pick up my laptop and run out the door, back when we could do that, I could sit at Starbucks, back when we could do that, and I could be editing the same file that I edited 2 minutes ago. So there are ways to enhance the usability and user friendliness of these things, which, as a consequence, or as sort of an additive benefit of that, increases security. But when you have to start forcing it by mandate, it starts to get a little, you're going to get resistance. That's just kind of the natural human nature, right?
There was also a lockdown when a lot of companies started disabling USB devices on corporate laptops. So you couldn't just offload the data to a thumb drive as a quick backup, or to an attached hard drive as a quick backup. And so that then goes back to you got to look at these, maybe I can upload it to Box or upload it to some other place as my secure location. After I've created that PowerPoint, whatever, I can make sure it's up there.
Yeah. And there's always going to be an element of trust. I mean, you'll never be able to completely prevent a user or an employee from doing something nefarious if they set their mind to it. So yeah, there has to be an inherent level of trust, and also recoverability. So, trust but verify.
I was going to say, it depends on the organization and the types of data you're storing, right? I have worked with government entities, government intelligence organizations, et cetera, and they have very strict mandates about where you should store data, how you're going to use it, et cetera. And it's a matter, that policy is a condition of your employment. If they catch you violating, you're gone, right? So it depends on which data it is and what type of organization you're working in, et cetera.
Yeah, I think there are organizations, maybe the global, 100 or 200, that are big corporations that kind of have, much like governments that force conditions of employment on data security. But for the average company, right? If we open up the aperture for the average company, I think you tend to find, and this is true, that until there's a disaster or something critical really happens, it doesn't really put that forcing function onto corporations to be able to do this. And this is why I think we have this conversation now, is to make people think about it. I mean, think about the fact that there's been this massive increase in cyber threats. How does this work from home initiative and cyber threats combined also impact what could possibly happen to a large corporation? I mean, data is now everywhere, right? And I think that's just another aspect or another avenue that you have to think of. And you have to think of both aspects. There's keeping the bad actors out, the cybersecurity component of it, but then there's the resiliency component, which is they're going to get in. So now that they're in, where are they? Are they on the desktop and the laptop? Are they in the home? Have they made it all the way back to corporate? How do we recover from something like this, right? It brings up a number of situations.
Yeah, for sure. And it also, again, using the pandemic as this kind of disruptive event, compelling event that's forced a lot of these policies to be changed and quickly modified and adapted to different, environments and at different scale. There were a lot of hiccups. There were a lot of problems early on in the pandemic when there was this sudden shift to a mass percentage of the workforce working from home. For those of us at IBM, it was probably less disruptive because we predominantly tend to do it anyway. But there are plenty of companies for which it was extremely disruptive, and it required a huge adjustment So now that the adjustments have been made, I think the other interesting probably topic of discussion for another day, more of a, a socioeconomic anthropological discussion is, so now when things return to normal, how likely is it that these changes are going to make it much more attractive, both from an organizational perspective and an employee kind of productivity or reach perspective to continue, working from home, right? It's like, is this the new normal? I tend to think it is,
I
but
think it's the new normal.
We're already seeing those big companies make those announcements that they'll allow that work from home to continue. And so this is definitely an aspect that data administrator needs to sit back and look and say, okay, do we have the correct policy around protecting at home?
which itself obviously has huge implications for the airline industry, the hotel industry, any travel related industry or industry segment. Not good news for them, certainly. But, anyway, that's probably a whole topic of discussion that we could have a separate whole show about. But
I think the networking companies, the broadband companies are the big winners in this kind of thing.
yes, they have.
So, Randy, I want to bring it back to something that you were talking about, which is the utilization of tools and solutions like Dropbox. So this week in the news, you found something pretty interesting around DLP. Is that correct?
Yeah, DLP, data loss prevention. Yeah. So I guess we could potentially file this as one among these many different elements of the new world order, I guess, or the new pandemic state of affairs that are driving a lot of these companies and technologies. And again, on the plus side, it is fostering a lot of innovation. There's a lot of companies that are doing a lot of interesting research around autonomous resiliency and the ability for these systems to quickly adapt on their own based on machine learning and AI, which, as IBMers is kind of cool for us in a sense, because we play as a company a pretty significant role here. But even beyond that, there are other companies. And I found an interesting article here in Forbes a couple of days ago, today it posted actually, about a company called Secure Circle, which is a SaaS-based provider that specializes in not just resiliency and protection, but this whole data loss prevention. And Tricia, this certainly brings in one of your points that you mention a lot, which is critically important and becoming increasingly important every day, is classification. How effectively, quickly, adaptively can we classify data? So, just reading through this, it's a pretty interesting story or a pretty interesting narrative around how do you enhance existing security practices and policies by, again, leveraging machine learning, leveraging these adaptive pattern recognition algorithms to do things like identify PII in flight to prevent it from, being pushed out over the network. How do you do it in a way that is minimally disruptive? Because one of the things that we don't talk a lot about, but is mentioned here as a very important element, is, securing data stops work from happening, right? Properly implemented security practices and policies and solutions, by their nature, introduce additional steps into a workflow. So they're going to hinder productivity. How can we get around that? How can we work around that and minimize and mitigate it so that work can continue to proceed as efficiently and effectively as possible, but can still be maintained at a secure, compliant level? So this is a kind of an interesting emerging, field that seems to be picking up a lot of steam. I did a quick other separate search on, data loss prevention as a kind of search term, and interestingly, there was a huge spike in data loss prevention as a subset of broader cyber resiliency right around February of 2020. So not surprisingly, as the pandemic was hitting and all of these massive disruptions were happening, people began to take a much keener interest in this, probably because of the things we talked about earlier. They're having to now scale up their infrastructure and their data resiliency to levels they'd never thought possible or never imagined. And it suddenly required them to think differently and more innovatively about how they solve this productivity problem. So I thought it was kind of interesting. And this company has a bunch of different offerings that are based on, we talked earlier about the distinction between the device and the data. You can secure an endpoint device, and we do it and have been doing it for a long time, pretty predictably. But when it comes to securing the data, regardless of where it is, when it is, what it is, that becomes a lot more challenging and requires a lot more sophisticated and innovative solutions. And, this is an interesting example of a company that's attacking that problem by looking at data security and data movement from multiple sources, whether it's, we talk about hybrid multi-cloud and the rapid growth of hybrid multi-cloud, this is an interesting approach to kind of trying to solve that problem in a consistent way and reduce some of the headwinds to productivity. So anyway, I just thought it was kind of interesting, posted in Forbes, and there's other things we could talk about here, but I just thought it was kind of cool.
Well, what I was thinking about was tying that back to your whole Dropbox analogy and example, and just thinking 2 years ago, we started talking about modernizing data protection or modern data protection. This year, we've evolved that conversation to data resilience that combines cyber resiliency as well as the ability to just recover your data in any event. And now we're talking about data loss prevention, bringing data back from any particular case, taking advantage of intelligence around AI and that sort of thing. This entire space, data protection, continues to evolve. And while traditional IT folks will say, it's backup, it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? I think we all need to be prepared and be thinking about all the different things that can help enhance data protection in our corporations as it continues to evolve, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes back to what Sean said earlier. You can, if you do it in a way that makes it more productive, easier to use, has a more desirable feature set, or kind of results in higher productivity and better workflow, then you can sneak it in under the covers in a way. You can say, hey, we've got this great new global file sync and share facility, or this new, in-flight data protection, automated, fast, rapid recovery, seamless, transparent. So you can make it very attractive, but the back end benefits to the organization or the enterprise are better data protection, better sovereignty, better reliability, more recoverability. So you can sort of have both if it's properly implemented. And I think, again, trying to, emphasize the positive here, I think it's driving a lot of innovation in this space that might not otherwise have accelerated this quickly. So I guess that's something positive we can take from it.
And maybe also the thought that if there is some type of data leak, data spill, where you're putting this type of personal information and it gets into the backup systems, what are the steps that the backup administrator can take so that they have like an emergency on aisle 3 type of, okay, this is how we're going to clean up that mess immediately.
The break glass in case of, yeah.
Great. Well, Randy, thanks for sharing that. Well, I want to thank everyone again for watching, and until next week, thanks again.